There's now a continuum in terms of gender within the trans community. So you've got people identify, I don't know all of the identification, but non-binary. So there's people saying, I don't identify with either. What would be your explanation there in terms of genetically?
Well, I think if it's like height and you have men who are short and men who are tall, and most people somewhere in the middle,
Yes.
if gender identity is the same, you have men who are very masculine, men who are very feminine, most people somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
And you expect to have a decline in the number of people who very strongly want to be female, or who not so strongly want to be female, quite happy to dress up a bit, but aren't, are generally fairly happy living as a man as long as they can express their feminine side in some way or another.
Yes.
To the middle of the road where most people are going to be, to the other extreme where you have very gung-ho masculine males.
Yes. I suppose I wonder, thinking about it now, that the same thing with sexuality. So you might have people who are maybe genetically combined with culture and environment, very, very heterosexual, and then people who are very, very homosexual.
Absolutely.
But
yep.
maybe because some of the environmental constraints are being removed, like societal constraints, so we're changing the way that we behave as a society and some of our societal norms, there are more people sort of moving towards the middle.
Oh, I'm sure. Well,
because are there more people in the middle?
I think there's always more people in the middle when you have any kind of spread with many genes involved, like height.
Like
most
a bell
people will be
curve.
a bell curve, if you like. So it's the people on either side who can run into trouble because their feeling about themselves is not coordinate with their biology. I would expect as we become more accepting, and hopefully we are becoming more accepting,
Yes.
we'll find more and more people coming out as trans or wanting to express their feminine side more
Yes.
openly. And one hopes that that's exactly what's happening now.
Because I feel like there is some resistance to your research as well. In the articles that I've read, I think Sally Goldner from Transgender Victoria, they're very concerned about the study at Monash University because they didn't want they didn't think it was such a bad idea that you could find some biological determinants, but this was sort of the same thing with the Hamer.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the people didn't want to necessarily, they were concerned about being reduced to biological elements and genetics.
Well, I think
because
they were
felt
practically concerned with the idea that that parents could test their embryos and reject those that had gay genes.
Like a test, essentially.
Exactly.
Yep.
And I think those were very real concerns.
Yes.
And what I'm hoping is there'll be so many genes involved that it'll be impossible to test and predict.
Yes.
And I'm sure that is what's happening with homosexuality. There's going to be a lot of genes there. It really is not going to be possible to make a predictive test.
Yes.
And so hopefully that just isn't going to happen.
Because I suppose I feel like the part of the concern was also that if people are tested, let's say you're a man who identifies as a woman, but you don't show up the right genes and things like that, then where do you fall? Whereas the social constructed idea is kind of all encompassing.
I got some very interesting comments back on my transgender article, which I think you haven't read yet.
Yes.
And one person was making the point that it would be useful to have a predictive test because, for instance, if you had a child who was expressing transgenderism, now we know that half those children are going to change their mind and become cisgender on puberty.
It was about 80%, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. And you don't want to obviously do drastic surgery on somebody who's then going to change their mind because that's horrible for everybody.
That's a natural part of child development as
Oh,
well.
absolutely.
Like having some of what they'd call now fluidity in terms of gender. In terms of identity is a very natural thing for children to do.
Oh, I think so. And I think one wants to encourage girls to climb trees and boys to like art. That
Yes.
we'd like to have children who had the full range of experiences. But it's obviously important to know which kids are not going to change their mind and passionately want to be the other sex.
Yes.
And if there were, this commenter said, if there were a predictive test, you would know which kids are really going to want to change sex. Now, that's kind of in opposition to the, if it were possible to do a predictive test, then maybe there would be embryo selection or terminations,
Right.
which I think nobody wants.
Yeah.
So I can see that
There's a concern, though.
There's a concern. I can see there might be valid reasons for wanting a predictive test, but to me the dangers far outweigh the benefit.
Yes. Because they're concerned about things like neo-eugenics.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is always a concern.
Yes,
With, like
of
even
course.
in the development of tests for developmental disorders. So as you expand, so we have tests for Down syndrome, and as you expand that, they want to expand more tests out to pick up more developmental
Yes.
disorders. But some people have looked at that and said, well, the rate of then voluntary selective abortion for people for embryos with Down syndrome is, what's 80% in France
Yes.
or something like that. So it's actually a form of neo-eugenics.
Well, of course, I'm very familiar with those arguments, and I would have to say from my knowledge of people who have had babies with severe congenital defects, I would certainly go for genetic testing on all serious developmental effects and
Yes.
selective abortion.
Yes.
But I know people who chose to carry a baby to term even though they knew it would have no brain.
Yes.
Now, to me, I can't understand how you could possibly do that.
So that's anencephaly or something.
Yeah,
like.
anencephaly.
Yeah.
That's, to me, so horrible I can't even think about it. But,
Right.
in terms of Down syndrome, I know people also who have had a Down's diagnosis and chosen to continue the pregnancy and who love their Down's
Yes.
child. I mean, Down's
Yes.
children are very lovable.
Yes.
So there's
Well,
there's no line.
No, well, I
there.
suppose it's labelled that, but it's simply an ethical question.
Yes.
So it raises interesting.
I don't think anybody would want selective abortion against embryos who were not going to be good tennis players, for instance. That's getting into the designer baby thing, and
Yeah.
I think very few people would support that. And then on the other side, there are horrible, horrible syndromes that you would not wish a baby to live for 3 years with any of these horrible syndromes. But, in that huge area, there are people who will opt for one or the other solution.